When you visit the Museum of Northern Arizona in Flagstaff, you'll see stunning fossil casts of prehistoric beasts, colorful paintings from local artists, and also lots and lots of pottery. The museum has tons of indigenous ceramics on display.
This is indicative of the museum's foundation, and also of what Flagstaff's culture was like in its earliest days. The museum's makeup is the aftermath of a battle between competing interests of Flagstaff's residents and the largest academic institutions in the country.
When Flagstaff was first settled in the late 1800s, residents quickly became intrigued with abandoned indigenous pueblo and cave-dwelling sites. At the time, it was common for white settlers to visit these sites to collect indigenous artifacts, which they then added to their own private collections or sold for commercial purposes in a practice known as pot hunting.
Pot hunting was part of early Flagstaff's identity. People's homes were filled with collections of indigenous relics, and residents felt a sense of ownership over the indigenous dwellings. Local papers covered the scores of relics collected by residents during their pot hunting excursions.
In 1884, the Arizona Champion reported that on one of these pot hunting excursions by local residents to the Petrified Forest, that it was safe to say that each visitor took away as many rare specimens as it was possible for them to carry as souvenirs of their visit.
At the time, this looting of indigenous artifacts was just part of daily life, and no one really took issue with it. But the richness of Northern Arizona's cultural identity did not go unnoticed outside of Flagstaff. It had caught the attention of archaeologists working for some of the country's biggest museums.
One of these archaeologists was Jesse Fuchs, who was conducting collecting expeditions for the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology in and around Flagstaff starting in the mid-1890s. Fuchs' expeditions unearthed thousands of indigenous artifacts from northern Arizona, which were then shipped to be studied and displayed in Washington, D.C.
Although these trained archaeologists like Fuchs often criticized locals and tourists for their unprofessional pot hunting, who they claimed were destroying indigenous sites and letting priceless artifacts fall into private hands, the archaeologists themselves were often just as destructive in their collecting practices.
Many Flagstaff residents were quick to point out the hypocrisy, and locals were also fed up watching what they viewed as their artifacts getting shipped hundreds of miles away to museums on the East Coast. They wanted these artifacts to stay in Flagstaff.
So, in response, a group of concerned citizens created the Arizona Archaeological Association, which advocated for the creation of a public collection of local artifacts in Flagstaff, and encouraged residents to donate their private collections to the association for safekeeping.
In the announcement of its founding in a local paper, the association took a shot at the Smithsonian, saying, "The Smithsonian Institute and Eastern colleges have taken away a great part of our antiquities, while Arizona has no collection formed or started. This association is stated for the purpose of keeping some of these antiquities at home." There was clearly mounting anger toward these Eastern institutions in Flagstaff. However, besides one attempt at a public collection in a local library, no true local collection of any prominence emerged, let alone anything you would call a museum. That was until the arrival of an important couple to Flagstaff from Pennsylvania, Harold and Mary Russell Colton. Harold was a professor of zoology, while Mary was a prominent artist in watercolors and oil paintings who studied at the Philadelphia School of Design for Women. The Coltons took a honeymoon trip in 1912 throughout the American West, and when they visited Flagstaff, they quickly fell in love with the region's natural scenery. In the following summers, they would return to Flagstaff on vacations, which the couple spent cataloging 100 small pueblo ruins east of Flagstaff, including the famous Eldon Pueblo.
Despite neither of them being trained archaeologists, the couple was meticulous and careful in their collecting practices, which set them apart from their contemporaries like Fuchs.
On their journeys, the Coltons befriended a notable local figure, Jesse Clark, a Tennessean who came to Flag while working for a telephone company. He was deeply fascinated with the indigenous sites, and, out of his own volition, became their de facto caretaker. Dr. Colton exchanged letters with Clark discussing the idea of bringing a museum to Flagstaff, which Colton devised in one letter could be a local antiquary society. that could be a benefit to science and an added resource to the city of Flagstaff.
Soon enough, in 1922, local papers renewed talks of a Flagstaff museum. Coincidentally, the Flagstaff's Women's Club was building a new facility for its organization, and they proposed creating a museum room in their new clubhouse.
This initiative was spearheaded by none other than Alice Clark, Jesse Clark's wife, and a member of the FWC. Alice was undoubtedly excited at the idea of a Flagstaff museum, and took up the cause when she heard about her husband's correspondence with Dr. Colton. In 1924, the museum room opened at the FWC's clubhouse. Soon enough, the club was inundated with a wave of artifact donations from local residents. But, as there was little organization or dedicated staff, the museum room fell into chaos, a victim of its own success.
As the FWC's museum room languished, a familiar face returned to Flagstaff: Jesse Fuchs. Interestingly, Fuchs had been working closely with Dr. Colton and Mr. Clark since 1916.
Despite having competing interests in where artifacts should land after their recovery, Colton and Clark saw Fuchs as a powerful ally. After all, he helped them secure a permit to save precious artifacts in the region that were being destroyed by the construction of the Route 66 National Highway. Ironically, the Colton's archaeological surveys of northern Arizona renewed Fuchs' interest in the region, including one identified by Mary, the site now known as Eldon Pueblo. The site had escaped the prying hands of pot hunters and archaeologists, leaving it completely undisturbed. But Fuchs was about to change that. Working with a team for the Smithsonian, in 1926, Fuchs led a 3-month excavation of Eldon Pueblo. That venture turned out to be a careless and, even by the standards of the time, unprofessional affair, to say the least.
Fuchs' workers dug through 30 rooms in Eldon Pueblo using horse-drawn plows, without cataloging or measuring the sites. They disturbed over 150 indigenous graves, and Fuchs had some of the most precious artifacts stored in his private collection before sending them to DC. But it's important to remember that in the early 1900s, archaeologists like Fuchs were not working under strict guidelines or agreed-upon practices. These archaeologists were told by the organizations they worked for to basically collect as many artifacts as they could, and as you can imagine, the results were often destructive.
Clark originally helped Fuchs with unearthing Eldon Pueblo, but soon became disillusioned. Clark said the excavation was the latest notable example of the hogging of Arizona's archaeological treasures by the Smithsonian Institution, and told one of his colleagues that after working with Fuchs that summer, he wouldn't care to see Fuchs ever again. Only a few years later, Fuchs passed away, but the consequences of his excavation would reverberate for years to come.
In the summer of 1927, Dr. Colton, through some politicking in Flagstaff's Chamber of Commerce, inspired Grady Gamage, president of the Northern Arizona State Teachers College and one of the committee's chairmen, to organize another committee to consider founding a museum in northern Arizona.
In the halls of the NASTC's campus, 36 people, including the Coltons and Clark, formulated the principles of what would become the Museum of Northern Arizona. Dr. Colton was the greatest influence on the museum's ethos. He argued that the museum should focus on everything the region had to offer, both scientifically and culturally, with exhibits on archaeology, art, biology, and geology. By next summer, the process of opening a museum was in full swing. Mary Colton took charge of the arts and crafts section, Clark oversaw the archaeology, and Dr. Colton and his colleagues rallied support for the museum at local clubs. Finally, in September of 1928, the Museum of Northern Arizona opened its doors to the public.
In the years following the museum's foundation, the museum's indigenous artifacts collections grew rapidly as local residents brought their private collections to the museum, with the added promise that their names would be attached to the pieces once on display.
This video was inspired by Every Yard Boasted a Matadi, Pot Hunting, Archaeology, and the Creation of the Museum of Northern Arizona by William F. Stoudemeyer, from the summer 2022 edition of the Journal of Arizona History.
If you're interested in purchasing a previous edition or becoming a subscriber to the Quarterly Journal, visit arizonahistoricalsociety.org/publications for more information. Thank you for watching.